My guest on this special edition of Talk It Over is Senator Barry M. Goldwater, man who has served in the Senate since 1952, ran for the presidency of this country in 1964, and a man who was commissioned by his fellow Republicans to go tell then-President Nixon that they no longer would stand still for the Watergate troubles that were going on and that he had better resign. What kind of feeling goes through your stomach when you have to go tell the president to resign?
I never want to do it again. We actually didn't tell him he had to resign. We told him that he didn't have the votes in the Senate or the House to withstand impeachment. And we let him think about it, because if he'd wanted to stand for impeachment, it would have meant 6 to 8 months when the country absolutely would stand still. We would do no legislation, nothing. So he thought about it most of that afternoon and night, and the next day he announced he was going to resign.
You think he got a fair shake by the country?
I do. He was a dishonest man. I think I would have shook him up a little more.
So then you wouldn't have been for President Ford pardoning him?
No, in fact, President Ford called me the morning he pardoned him, and I said, "Mr. President, what are you pardoning him for? Nobody's impeached him, nobody's made any formal charges. As far as we know, he's as free as the wind right now. So what have you forgiven him?" And I said, "I think you've made a mistake." But that was the way it went.
What about, let's start with the various presidents that you have observed or known. Did you ever get to meet President Truman, or?
Oh yes, I'm a great admirer of Harry Truman. I never agreed with much that he did, but I think Harry Truman will go down as one of our greatest presidents. That may sound funny coming from me, and you may wonder why. Nobody ever had to ask the question, where does Harry Truman stand on this issue? We all knew it. He was an easy man to talk to. I won't say I knew him well, but I had occasions to know him, and I liked him.
What about President Eisenhower?
Well, Eisenhower was a man that he had to grow on you. You had to keep in mind he was a 5-star general, and I finally got up to be a lieutenant colonel. And you always sort of stood in awe of those 5 stars and the fact that he was the commander of our combined forces. But I think he is getting better and better as history goes on. He's one of the most honest men I ever knew in my life. Like I've said about West Pointers, I've known some of the worst dogs in the world who graduated from West Point, but I never knew one that ever told a lie or stole or cheated. And Eisenhower, to me, was a perfect example of what a cadet graduated from West Point should be like. I had a great affection for him.
We'll be right back, and we'll ask Senator Goldwater what he thought of Presidents Kennedy and Johnson and Ford and Carter. With No Apologies, the book that Senator Goldwater wrote. A very interesting book. It tells in detail some of the history of our country.
Yeah.
Let's pick up with Kennedy.
I like Jack Kennedy very much. We served on the Labor Committee together. We had lots of fights on a political nature. He was a very pleasant man, a great sense of humor. He had one of the most absorbent brains I've ever run into. He'd come into a committee room not knowing anything at all about what we were talking about, And he'd sit there for a few minutes and he'd have a very, very good grasp of everything that was going on. I really think that had Jack Kennedy lived, he would have been one of our great presidents. I think it was terribly unfortunate that a young man died at a young age, because there were a lot of young people just coming up then that looked to Jack for leadership, and I really think he would have provided it.
In your book, you talk about some of the dirty tricks that the Kennedy campaign pulled on Hubert Humphrey in the West Virginia primary.
Yeah.
And for a man whose honesty is a big thing with you, I'm surprised that you admired Kennedy that much. Or do you think he was not responsible personally for those dirty tricks in West Virginia?
I don't think he knew they were going on. When you go give a voter a pint of whiskey or a couple of dollars. But let's face it, some of those things are done in every election in some states. Nobody ever called anybody on it, but I don't think Jack knew about those things.
Did he ever call you while he was president and seek your counsel?
Yes, I used to see a lot of Jack. I'll never forget one day during the Bay of Pigs, I was going to fly a jet airplane out here to Luke, and I was just getting strapped in the airplane, had on my flight suit, my helmet, and my boots, and the sergeant came out and jumped up on the wing and said, "The president wants to see you." Well, that's command. So I had to get out, get all dressed, go down. I can't tell you what he said to me because it was rather on the dirty side, but he thought I was crazy for wanting to be president when he was burdened down with all these problems that he was presented with by the Bay of Pigs. And we talked about it and what he should and shouldn't do and things like that. He'd call me.
Did you ran for president,
Yeah.
but I know your heart is always in Arizona. And in reading your book, it seemed like your fellow conservatives kind of pushed you. Was it a case of them pushing you, or did you truly want to be president of the United States when you started
Oh,
off?
I think any man who said he doesn't want to be president of the United States is just a damn liar. Sure, I wanted to be president of the United States. Maybe I didn't seem to want it that badly. It was sort of thrust on me. I didn't organize anything to get it. A bunch of people, young people in Washington, put the whole thing together, and the first thing I knew, I was a candidate. And then when Jack Kennedy was killed, I backed out. And then in December of that year, they came and talked me into it again, and so with one leg in a cast and standing on crutches, I announced that I'd run for president. I never have regretted it. I learned a lot about America. I learned to love America a little more. I learned a lot about the great, wonderful people that make up this country. And I think today I probably have as good a grasp of America as any man living.
Let's go back to Lyndon Johnson. I hope the camera got that shot.
Oh, Lyndon was all right. I knew Lyndon very well. He was a great leader of the Senate. We got work done. He'd keep you there and make you work. We haven't done it since. But Lyndon also liked to use his power and abuse his power. And I think he abused it a little bit too much. With all due respect to him, I don't think he will go down in history with the respect, say, that Eisenhower or Truman or Roosevelt or Kennedy have. He wasn't that kind of a man.
You met with him one of the last few hours while he was president, or last few days, and he was
Yes.
telling you about his frustrations.
Yes, I just went up to say hello. It was his last day in office, and we talked about the campaign, and I reminded him that I thought then that he would have been better off had he talked with me about the Vietnam War, not debated it. But the American people should have realized that regardless of who won the campaign, we still had Vietnam. And I thought the American people should know more about it. They didn't know much about it. He refused to do that. I think he grew to realize that that was a mistake. But, we sat around the Oval Office, had a couple drinks, and next thing you knew, he was ex-president.
And with that, we'll pause and we'll be back and talk about Carter and President Reagan. Senator Goldwater is my guest, and we're talking about the men who have served in the presidency of the United States. Let's pick up with Jerry Ford.
Well, Jerry's one of the nicest men I think I've ever known in my life. I worked with him when he was in the House. He and John Rhodes of our 1st District in Arizona were very, very close. And I think he brought back to the presidency the respect that Nixon had lost for it. I think it's way, way too early to say whether Jerry Ford was a great president, a good president, or what. But I think his place in history is going to be the man who restored faith and confidence in the office of president. And if he does nothing else, that's good enough for me.
And what about President Carter?
I think President Carter tried. I don't think he was mentally equipped. I think he was spiritually equipped. He was a God-fearing man. Again, you ask a man to judge a president, you have to give him time. I'd say a president should be dead or out of office at least 50 years before anybody tries to evaluate him. If you read history, that's pretty much the way things have gone. So he was a pleasant fellow. I've had a few arguments with him. We were fortunate in winning them. So that's the way it went.
You think we'll ever see another man run for president the way Carter did, where he sort of came from nowhere and somehow captured his party's nominating
Yes,
contention?
I think it can be done. When you see what we're going through today, we have 6 or 7 men, Democrats, all running for the office. And there's so much importance placed now on little elections like Iowa, where maybe 20% of the people vote. New Hampshire, where about the same percentage vote. And all of a sudden, the winner of that becomes the front runner. I think this can happen. I'm not happy with the way we elect presidents, but that's an entirely different subject, and it'll take a long time. I wish we did it in a different way. England can elect their prime ministers in 2 weeks. It takes us 2 years. It costs too much money, and there's too many promises made that they can't keep.
And now we're up to the president,
Yeah.
President Reagan, a man that came from the conservative wing of the Republican Party.
Well, of course, I like the president. It's all I can do to keep from calling him Ron, and I always call him Mr. President out of respect. I think he is what the American people needed at this time. Now, you may not agree with everything he says, but he says it in an honest way. He talks not to the American people, but with the American people. And actually, we have more people working now than at any time in our history. The economy has never been running as good as it's running now. Inflation has dropped down. Interest rates have dropped down. I'm not saying they can't go back up, but I think what the American people asked Reagan for, he's given them. He's given them a chance to be proud of their country. And that was a big deficit. So I think the second term of Reagan, when he'll certainly be reelected, I think everybody's going to wind up being very, very happy with it.
But it seems what's emerging now that he seems to have gotten inflation under control, are the huge deficits. And this was a man that came to office promising to reduce the deficits,
Well,
and instead he's got the highest budget of anybody who's held office so far.
that's absolutely right, and I've been fighting deficits for 30 long years and gotten no place. What the American people don't realize is about 70% of their money that we spend, we have no control over. The Congresses have passed bills creating an agency. And once you've created that agency, you have to appropriate money for it. Now, we don't have control unless we want to stop the agency altogether. That's not easy to do. So when you can only control 25 to 30% of the total budgeted money, it's pretty hard to hit that deficit. But I will say this: if we don't begin making inroads on the deficit this year, I don't care if it's 5 billion or 10 billion or 20 billion. I'd rather have it 20 billion. I think this country's in for some terribly hard trouble. If we continue with deficit spending, we can very well go bankrupt. I lived long enough in my life to see Austria do that and create a world depression. We're in the same fix Austria was. We're doing the same things. We're spending money we don't have. We're borrowing money that we don't have. So I just pray that we have the combined guts in the Congress to just say, no, we don't need that, as much as we know some people do need it. I think we're going to have to start living without things.
We'll be back in a moment, and I want to ask Senator Goldwater, with his knowledge of the national defense needs, whether he would peg this year's budget that high. Senator Barry Goldwater is our guest for this edition of Talk It Over. You perhaps know more about the defense organization and our defense needs than any other civilian, non-military person, which puts you in a good light because military always want more for military. Anybody would do that. What do you think? And then President Reagan tells us that we've got to have all this budget override for military purposes. Is he right? Are we in that bad a defense shape?
Well, number one, let's start out by recognizing that about 43% of that budget goes to pay the troops, put clothes on their back, and feed them. Now, you can't start cutting that.
No. Okay.
So it leaves you with around, say, 54 or 5%. I'm convinced that we can cut money from the budget. I can't say how much. A few years ago, I was able to get the price of our brand new helicopter reduced $2.5 million a copy, which adds up to about $800 million. Now, if we just sit down and get tough about it and tell the manufacturer we don't care how badly the military say they need it, we're not going to put it on the appropriations list at those prices. We have to have a concentrated attack on the high cost of weaponry. When we pay as much as $40 million for a single-seat fighter, that's way out of line. When we've allowed the B-1 bomber, which we have to have, to now get up to almost $225 million a copy, that's too much. I think that this year we can have a reduced budget. I wouldn't say we're going to cut the daylights out of it, but if we can effect a 7% reduction, that will be about $15 billion, and that's about as much as I would expect. Anything more, we'll welcome.
Is there a way to once and for all stop the spending that we hear the Pentagon spends $93 for a screw that would cost 5 cents in the hardware store?
Oh,
what causes that, and what can we do about it?
That goes on all over government. I don't think that's going to go on anymore because the whistle has been blown. Oh, I can tell you more stories that you wouldn't believe about warehouses back there filled with office furniture that have never been used. Just sitting there. Somebody bought them. We have equipment all over that town. We have equipment all over the country. I can take you around Tucson and show you pieces of equipment that have never been used. Nobody has ever really put the squeeze on our money. I think President Reagan is trying the hardest of anybody I know. The item veto that he wants, I think, would be an excellent move, but he's not going to get it from this Congress. It's just going to take real hard work. It's going to require people like me and people like Mo Udall and all the rest of us saying no to something that we may want worse than anything else for Arizona. But we've got to quit being parochial about all these things. If it's made in our backyard and we have to live without it, we have to live without it. That's a hard thing to say to the people who live in our state. But that's the only way we're going to get our budgets down. It's the only way we're going to have our taxes come down. It's the only way we're going to continue to exist.
Do you think that the American public is sufficiently up for it or scared enough that after the election they will say, raise our taxes or cut our pet projects, because they're frightened that this might really be the beginning of the end if we don't do it?
Well, they ought to be frightened because Social Security is about bankrupt again. Railroad retirement's bankrupt. Civil service doesn't have much money left in it. In fact, those of us who are older have some money to look forward to, but those who are in their 40s and early 50s, I feel kind of sorry for because it doesn't look good. I think the American people understand these things, and I want the president to sit down in front of the tube and just say, I'm on a level with you. Here's where we are. Now let's get to work.
I thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Talk It Over.